So, what does a massive, crumbling empire have in common with a resistance movement that's lasted for centuries? Well, today we're going to look at the fall of Rome and compare it to the rise of African feminism to tackle one really big question: what actually makes a civilization last?
Okay, let's just dive right in with a question that I know sounds a little wild. What on earth could the collapse of ancient Rome possibly have to do with modern feminism? Well, as it turns out, when you put these two totally different histories side by side, you start to see something really fundamental about what it takes to build something that truly endures.
All right, first up, let's talk about one of history's most famous case studies in total collapse: the Roman Empire. We tend to think of it as this unstoppable, eternal force, right? But its foundations, they were surprisingly fragile. So, according to the research of scholar Hunter M. Bruno, the entire Roman system basically balanced on three pillars that were all connected: its grain production, which fed everyone, including the army; its military policy; and its labor markets, which, and this is key, were super dependent on enslaved people. These weren't separate things, they were all gears in one giant machine. And what kept that machine running? Simple: constant military conquest. See, winning wars brought in land to grow grain, and even more importantly, it brought in captives to work that land as slaves. This created a cycle where the system didn't just like expansion, it absolutely needed it to survive. But what happens when you eventually run out of new places to conquer? Well, the whole system grinds to a halt. The supply of new land and labor just dries up, the grain supply starts to fail, and the army can't support itself anymore. The very engine that made Rome so powerful was also its fatal flaw. It was a brittle, unsustainable system, and eventually its story was finished. But here's the thing: while that system was at its absolute peak, it wasn't always winning. So now let's flip the script and look at a completely different story, a different model of power, one based not on endless expansion, but on fierce resistance. I want you to meet Queen Amanirenas of the Kingdom of Kush, which is in modern-day Sudan. When the Romans tried to expand south into her territory, she didn't just back down. Nope. She led an army against them. She reportedly lost an eye in battle, but she kept on fighting, raiding Roman forts, until the emperor, we're talking Caesar Augustus himself, was forced to sign a peace treaty, a treaty that guaranteed her kingdom's independence for decades. She stared down the unbeatable system, and she won. And here's what's so important: Queen Amanirenas wasn't just a one-off amazing hero. She was part of a long, often unwritten history of resistance, led by African women, a legacy that was passed down generation to generation. And this idea is really at the heart of our story today. For centuries, history books have often painted women as just kind of being there. But the reality, they were always at the center of the action. They were the architects of change. This legacy of resistance has changed and evolved, for sure, but it has never been broken. We can actually trace it across four distinct eras, from the powerful matriarchs of the pre-colonial era to the rebels of the anti-colonial struggle, the nation builders after that, and now to the digital activists of today. You see, in the pre-colonial era, women in leadership wasn't some rare exception. In many places, it was the rule. Just take Chikuku Mukamambo I in Zambia. She didn't just rule, she set up a system where only women could lead, a dynasty that actually continues to this day. For women like her, power wasn't something they had to fight for, it was something they already had. Then, in the anti-colonial era, the fight changed. When colonizers arrived, women like Josina Machel in Mozambique became soldiers and organizers on the front lines. And women like Julia Chikamonika in Zambia staged this incredibly powerful protest right in front of British officials, declaring, "The most vulgar thing for me was having my rights taken away." They used their words, their minds, and their very bodies as tools for liberation. After independence, the fight shifted again, from liberation to inclusion. Now women had to fight for their rightful place in the very nations they'd helped create. So what they do? They started building their own structures. Women like Bisi Adeleye Fayemi co-founded the African Women's Development Fund, the first ever Pan-African fund to make sure that women's movements had African resources to survive. They weren't just demanding change, they were funding it themselves. And that brings us right up to today, where this ancient legacy is being totally reimagined with brand new tools and this new, unapologetic energy. The new wave of millennial feminists,
They move at the speed of the internet. They can organize a protest, share a story, and build a global movement, sometimes in just a matter of seconds. What's different isn't the spirit of resistance, but the incredible speed and reach. And here's what's absolutely crucial about their approach. Activists like Olalady Funishi aren't just protesting. They're building the digital and academic archives to make sure this history is never erased again. They're not waiting for a seat at the table, they're creating their own platforms, their own funding, and their own memory. Okay, so let's bring it all back together. On one hand, we have the story of a massive, brittle empire built on expansion. On the other, we have an adaptive, enduring movement built on resistance. So what can we learn when we put them head to head? Well, here's the fundamental difference laid bare. Rome built monuments of stone. This legacy is built on movements of people. The empire was rigid and had to keep growing or it would break. The movement, it's adaptive, and it actually gets stronger under pressure. One system was basically designed to fail. The other is designed to evolve, to adapt, and to keep going. Ultimately, this isn't just about finding some forgotten figures from the history books. It's about recognizing a story that has actually never stopped, one that is constantly being rewritten by every new generation. So what's the big takeaway here? Maybe the truest sign of strength isn't how big an empire can get, but how well a movement can adapt, resist, and endure. It really leaves us with one final thought. The next time someone is telling a story from history and they ask, "So where were the women?" You'll know the answer. They were always there.